Hi there, esteemed audience, and welcome to another episode of Middle Grade Ninja. I'm Rob Kent, as you know, the author of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. What's left for me to say about this wonderful book that I haven't said already? Let's let Richard Adams take a shot at it. Richard Adams, author of Watership Down, one of the greatest novels in all of literature, said, "Let me say at once that I think this is a most original and amusing piece of work. A reader is arrested at the outset by a paradoxical witticism, and he goes on being arrested as the story gets into its stride. Ellicott Skulworth and Banneker Bones appear as characters about whom the reader wants to learn more, and soon he begins to be in no doubt about this." That quote is maybe 8, 9 years old at this point. It still gives me chills. It's still the most exciting thing ever. Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees is available as a paperback and audiobook narrated by David Radke, and the ebook is free to download whenever you're listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. So after the show or during, go ahead and get your copy downloaded. If you wanted to leave a review, that helps me out. Get you ready for Banneker Bones and the Alligator People, which will be out here hopefully in April or May of this year. Under the super secret pen name Robert Kent, I've written some older stories, including All Together Now, a zombie story, which is a young adult novel. It's the zombie apocalypse, so prepare for it to be bleak, for it to be violent. On the other hand, there's a lot of humor and a romance, as there would be. Also, All Right Now, a short zombie story, which is a companion piece. And then, if you really like the horror, I've written the Book of David, which is a 5 serial horror novel. It's about an atheist that buys a haunted house that then gives him religious visions involving UFOs. But really, for the middle grade crowd that might be watching or viewing or watching or listening to this, um, the language is a little bit rough. It's very much an adult story, but my favorite character in the story, Miriam Walters, David's wife, is a middle grade author, and we get to see her composing her middle grade series in a haunted house. She is sending out query letters to agents and collecting rejections. At the same time, there's an invisible monster stalking her from room to room. It's a good time. If you're a middle grade writer, you're listening or watching this, so I assume odds are decent you might be. You might enjoy this story. The first chapter of the Book of David is free to download as an ebook whenever you're listening to this. Coming up on the podcast/YouTube show, we've got some wonderful guests planned. We're going to have literary agent Jennifer March Soloway here in May 5th. We'll have author Stephen K. Smith, author Lamar Giles, author Kathy Appelt, and plenty more to come. Jessica Lawson is going to be joining us in April, as is literary agent Holly Root. We'll also have Daniel Jose Older later in the year, along with my friend Maurice Broaddus. It's going to be a wonderful show. I couldn't be more thrilled with it. Keep up with everything going on with the show and with me at middlegradeninja.com. If you head there, there are right now hundreds of interviews with authors, with literary agents, with publishing professionals that you can read, as well as the back catalog of all previous shows for the Middle Grade Ninja podcast, including an interview and 2 reviews of books by today's guest, Mr. Tommy Greenwald. Tommy, how are you doing today?
Good, Rob. Great to be here. Great to be with you.
I am thrilled to have you with us. I'm always thrilled because every episode of the show has been great so far, and I have no doubt that today is not going to be the exception.
The pressure's on. Oh, boy.
The pressure is on, but I like this. It's almost like having a miniature writers conference a couple of times a week, just right here without even having to leave my home, because we're going to pick your brain and we're going to learn all kinds of stuff about how to write and publish quality middle grade fiction.
Sure.
So, Tommy, why don't we start with you telling esteemed audience a little bit about the man, the myth, the legend. Give us kind of an overview of your background.
Sure. I mean, I often start school visits with saying something about being a writer. I ask kids if to raise their hands if they want to be a writer. A lot of kids often raise their hands, and sometimes I can tell kids want to raise their hand, but they don't. And I tell kids it's never too early to decide to be a writer. You can be in 1st grade or 4th grade or 6th grade. But on the other hand, it's never too late to decide to be a writer, because I'm a good example of someone who hadn't really thought about writing books for children until my mid-40s. I was a writer of different kinds of things. I write professionally because I'm an advertising executive. I do commercials for Broadway shows in New York City. I've written a musical. I've written a couple of screenplays that got sniffed around by Hollywood and then ultimately tossed away like so many others. I've written humor pieces for magazines and newspapers, but I had never written a novel, and I'd certainly never written a children's novel or a middle grade novel until I was in my mid-40s. I had kids of my own, and I struggled to get them to read. And I kind of looked around for a book that I thought would attract kids like my own kids, reluctant readers, but reluctant readers who are otherwise great kids, funny, smart, entertaining kids, because kids who don't like to read are just as awesome as kids who do like to read. And I couldn't find them. I found a lot of books about children who don't like to read, but they're usually serious books. They're usually books about kids who are having troubles at home or troubles in school, troubles with a friend, troubles with family. And sometimes a manifestation of those troubles comes out in not wanting to read or not wanting to learn. And these are great books. They usually end happily and with an uplifting story about the child discovering how reading can help and improve their life. And I loved those books, but it wasn't really the kind of book I was looking for. And once I realized I couldn't find it, I decided to try to write it. And that was how my first book, my first Charlie Joe Jackson book, came about, through the struggle of getting my own kids, Charlie, Joe, and Jack, to read.
And that is, for my money, the definitive book for encouraging children who don't want to read to read. I mean, it's all there in the title, Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading.
Yeah.
And it is,
Yeah.
I think about that book to this day since I first reviewed it, and I chuckle about it every so often. If I come across a passage of my own that's difficult, I think, well, I've already lost the Charlie Joe Jacksons of the world. All that's left are the hardcore readers.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, this is the cover of the book. When I first presented this title to the agent that I ultimately signed with, not this title, but this idea for the book, I thought it was going to be, I kind of designed it originally as a picture book idea called The Boy Who Hated Reading. And it was all about a kid who just was refusing to read no matter what his parents did to try to bribe him or get him to read. And she was the one who told me this is a good and funny idea for a book, but I should up it to the middle grade level, because that's the age kids are when they really decide whether they're going to read on their own. And now that their parents are going to start reading to them less and less, it's really up to the kid to make that independent choice. Will they hold the book themselves and read as opposed to all the other tempting things they could do, or will they go off, and if they're not going to be read to, they leave reading behind? So she was the one that kind of told me there's a niche out there in a marketplace for a middle grade book of this sort.
Obviously, it was a smart call, because this has spawned numerous sequels plus some
It did,
spin-offs.
yeah.
How many sequels are there now?
There are there's 6 Charlie Joe Jackson books altogether, and there are 3 spin-offs. There are books that are based on friends of Charlie Joe's. You've got Katie Friedman, who's his best friend, which was the first book I wrote from a girl's point of view. So that was a fun, interesting challenge. There was one of the Charlie Joes before the Katie Friedman book had excerpts written / narrated by Katie, because Charlie Joe was getting lazy and he wanted Katie to do some of the work for him. And
Brilliant technique. Just layer that right in.
Yeah, I did. Her book is called Katie Friedman Gives Up Texting, and that's a book about Katie giving up her phone for a week and getting 10 of her friends to give up her phone for a week. That was my cautionary tale about phone addiction, because, again, looking in my own household for inspiration, I saw my 3 kids were getting more and more addicted to their phones. Not to leave myself out of it, I too have my issues with phone addiction, screen addiction. I think we all do. So that was what the Katie Friedman book. Pete Milano was a friend of his, and he got a book about getting cast in a Hollywood movie called Pete Milano's Guide to Becoming a Movie Star. And Jack Strong Takes a Stand is a book about his camp friend, Charlie Joe's camp friend, Jack Strong, who is tired of being overscheduled and being shunted from activity to activity by his parents, and he finally gets fed up and goes on strike and refuses to get off his couch. So those were the 9 books that kind of make up the world of Charlie Joe Jackson.
And well, I've got a bunch of questions about Charlie Joe Jackson, so let's just start there.
Yeah.
with I guess first question that comes to mind, how did you initially overcome, or did you have to overcome any objections with librarians, teachers, people that you want to be your partners in helping to promote the books, who might say, well, wait a minute, guide to not reading, I don't want my kids reading that. I want them to read more. So obviously you did overcome, as evidenced by the fact that the series you've been so prolific and the series has continued to be successful for you. So how were you able to navigate that, or was it an issue?
It was a little bit of an issue. There was, librarians and teachers and people in the kid lit community by and large, have a great sense of humor, and they kind of know that this was I was trying to engineer some reverse psychology here by, I tell people that the title, I wanted a title that would pass the bookstore test, essentially, meaning if I took my kids into a bookstore or a library and they did what they usually did, my own kids or kids like them, where they just find an excuse to not want to pick up any book. No, too long, I don't like the cover, the title. If they see a book about how to avoid other books, it might at least stop them in their tracks because it's so odd and unusual. And to get a kid to read a book that promises to teach them how to avoid other books obviously sounds counterproductive, but if the reverse psychology plan works, they read this book and they realize, even possibly without consciously realizing, that it's an entertaining novel. It's a story with characters and situations, and it's got comedy, it's got a little bit of heart, it's got a little bit of a slight little message thrown in there, although, gosh, I hope it's not too heavy-handed. And then by the time they finish the book, they've kind of forgotten that they'd originally picked it up as a way to avoid books. I kind of doubled down on the joke with this, now with 25 exclusive non-reading tips, which are in there, but they're purely tongue-in-cheek. And the goal is to have a kid realize that, wait a second, this was fun, and I wouldn't mind reading another book, either in the series or like this. And almost all the librarians and teachers I encountered were right down with that. There was the occasional note I would get, or review on Goodreads or something, that would say, I don't understand, why would I pick up a book, or why would I encourage my students to read a book about how to avoid books? But those were the outliers. By and large, the community was supportive. And it was on the heels of the wimpy kid phenomenon too. So I think the educational and parent community were realizing that there was a way to get these notoriously finicky, reluctant readers to pick up a book. And if we could find more product that would help them do that, it's all to the good. Luckily, I will say I've been lucky in that people who love to read have also gravitated to the series over the years. So I want to convey that it's just purely a reluctant reader mission book. It was certainly the original intent, was to get those kinds of kids to read. But over time, Charlie Joe himself grew, and he himself did learn actually to enjoy the act of reading on occasion. And by the time the series ended, it was just, to me, kind of a good old-fashioned middle grade series with characters kids hopefully enjoy and wanted to see change and grow over time.
It's a bit of a dirty trick, kind of, sort of, as well, because it starts off with very short chapters, lots of illustrations, and then as you go on, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. You put in a little bit more narration, a little bit more plot complication, and we're still laughing at Charlie Joe and his plans to not read. But by golly, about midway through, we're reading a book, we're enjoying a story.
I hope so. From your lips to God's ears, as they say. That was the intent, and there are a lot of jokes about that too. As early tips are, make sure every book you read has short chapters. And if your parents say you don't read, just show them all the ways you do read, menus and video game instructions and these sorts of things. So while the first half of the first book is really all about the act of reading versus not reading, by the time the second book comes along, and definitely by the third book, you've kind of forgotten that original premise and hopefully are now just into these characters.
You were working with, I want to make sure I get the illustrator's name right, with J.P. Couvert, correct, on that one?
Yeah. Yeah.
So with a book like that, it's
Yeah.
not quite a picture book, but those pictures are absolutely instrumental in telling the
Very much
story.
so.
And
Yeah.
I've seen you multiple places wearing a T-shirt with the drawing of Charlie Joe Jackson on it. So I'm assuming you're on board with the final product.
I am
Um,
involved, yeah.
how much influence did you have on those illustrations? How closely did you work with J.P. Kubert?
Well, it's a good question, and it tends to the answer tends to surprise people, especially people who aren't familiar with how it works. Kids, for example, in the school visits I do, this never fails to amaze kids. Because the fact is, I don't really work with the illustrator at all. What happens is the editor, my wonderful editor, Nancy Mercado, who edited the Charlie Joe series, she offered me, I believe, 3 illustrators to look at and said, these are the 3 people I've honed in on. They didn't draw anything for Charlie Joe at that point. She was just showing me their portfolios. And together we picked JP, who was a cartoonist and a comic strip creator, I think in Minneapolis. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct, but in the Midwest somewhere. And he'd done 1 or 2 other children's books, but not too many. And once we selected him to be the illustrator of the books, Nancy's the one who goes off and works with him and picks the moments for him to illustrate within the book. They create the character together. She did show me some early renderings of Charlie Joe specifically because we both knew how important that was. And there were a couple of early attempts that I think, as I recall, I thought that they were a little young looking. There were things that needed to be tweaked, and I participated in those conversations, but only through Nancy, who would then relay these notes back to JP. So he and I never worked directly together at all, and that's been the case on all of my illustrated books. It's always done through the editor as a middle person. Which at first I was like, is it really? I mean, I think anybody who's new to the business would be surprised by that, any writer. But as
Surprise slash horrified.
yeah, I didn't realize that I didn't realize that it would be that church and state. But as over time, I realized that it does make the most sense for it to be that way, for the editor to be the gatekeeper of all the creative materials. And I help pick the moments that should be illustrated, and then I will see sketches of the illustrations. And all along the way, I'm allowed to kind of participate in the final product of the illustrations as a note giver, not as a collaborator, really. And it's worked really well by and large.
In all fairness, I'm being a little facetious. I work with my cover artist, Stephen Novak, to design all these wonderful covers.
Yeah.
I usually start with some kind of concept and give him an idea, or I've worked with my illustrator, Adam Smith, as well. And what I found consistently is if that's what I was good at, I'd be doing it.
Yep.
So it's usually better for me to just say, well, maybe this, maybe that, and then get out of the way and let them do what they do, because that's why they are who they are.
I've written one picture book, a book called Hooked, which unfortunately I don't have in front of me, but it's a book about a boy ice fishing with his dad. And that was also published by Macmillan about 4 or so years ago. And that was a real eye opener, because I wrote the text and said it started as a short story, actually, in a magazine called Storyworks that Scholastic puts out. And I took it to Macmillan and I said, I have a great idea I think this could be a great picture book. I have this person who illustrated it and for the magazine, and I have a couple of other illustrators. And they basically patted me on the head like a nice little boy and said, oops, I'm sorry. Patted me on the head and said, this is lovely, and we actually are interested in the text, but you just leave the illustrator to us. You go over here and wait, and when we have an illustrator that we think is appropriate, we'll let you know. And Rob, I kid you not, it took 3 years. 3 years between me selling the text of that picture book and them coming back and saying, we've talked to a bunch of people, and this is the guy we've settled on, this great illustrator named David McPhail. And
for 3 years, were you just in a state of despair of, oh no, my book's not going to happen after all?
There were moments where I totally thought it wasn't going to happen. And I'd heard stories of the length of time it takes for a picture book to happen, because illustrators have projects backed up, and the kind of putting the puzzle together is apparently a real saga. But I'd heard that it takes a year to bring an illustrator on board, or a year and a half. So 3 years, I was pretty sure that the book had kind of just fallen by the wayside. So I was
They at
thrilled
least
that it
given you
happened at
some
all.
money.
They'd given me a bit of an advance, and which was nice. But when you write a picture book, I mean, you write any children's book, actually, you're never really doing it for the money, because you're lucky if money comes your way. But the idea that anybody would go into writing books for children for money is comical, of course. But in picture books, it's kind of that times two, because it's just a complete crapshoot whether the advances are, at least for me, it was low. And so I assume the publisher could have said, if we never find an illustrator for this book, it's not the end of the world. So, but to their credit, they found an illustrator, and a great illustrator. I was thrilled with how the book came out. But that was a situation where he just drew the pictures, sent them in, and the book was put together by the editor. I didn't really have much to do with how the illustrations came out at all. And there are other stories about picture books. I have a lucky and a happy story, but I do know some authors who have been unthrilled with how the illustrations ended up working with their original text. So you never know. I've been blessed with great illustrators, I think, in all my series, and sensitive editors who have found the right people. So it's worked out well for me. But if you're not a writer illustrator, if you're just a writer, you know that you're putting your illustrations in the hands of your editors and your illustrators, and ultimately not having that much to do with how they ultimately come out.
Makes sense to me. And then now let me ask you this: at this point in your career, now that you're the Tommy Greenwald, that you had several successful series, you're starring on the Middle Grade Ninja podcast. So pretty much the height of
the pinnacle, baby. This is it.
So at this point, do you have a little bit more sway than you maybe did early on, or is it about the same?
It's about the same. I mean, the most recent series, illustrated series that I'm working on is this kind of funny, sweet zombie series called Project Z. And I don't really want to call it a zombie series because there's only one zombie in it. Everybody else is a real human person. But again, this was heavily, really quite heavily illustrated. Actually, this is a galley, so it's hard to see. There's only a few illustrations in the galley, but the ultimate book is going to be quite heavily illustrated. You can see a couple of illustrations. And
that's going to be coming out in May?
That's coming out in May, yeah. And again, it was I think I was shown one or two illustrators, and we picked this guy, Dave, who's done a really nice job. But even though I am the Tommy Greenwald, it's still not really a situation where I can dictate the illustrator. I'm be curious to know. I'm sure there are plenty of writers who do reach the level where they say, I want this guy to draw the pictures for my books, but I ain't there yet. I don't know if I'll ever get there. We'll see.
I don't know. Maybe we'll talk to James Patterson someday, and he'll be like, "No, they won't let me pick."
That would be amazing. But it's possible. He might say, "I don't want to pick." I leave it to them, and I'm sure he picks
apocryphal tale that may or may not be true, because you know how these things get passed around. I didn't hear it from James Patterson himself, but I did hear once that he was booked at a bookstore in Florida for a signing. And he showed up, and they didn't have his books. He had to go to his car and get boxes out. And I heard this within the last 10 years. So this is post Alex Cross.
That is not good. That's you don't want to. He's the wrong guy to forget the books of, because he's an ace. Everybody knows how prolific he is, but he's also incredibly generous with his donations of books to schools and to bookstores and to indie bookstores. So we want to stay on James Patterson's good side, I would imagine.
And James Patterson, if by any chance you're hearing or watching this and you're saying, well, that's not true, don't tell me. I'm really clinging to that story when I have book signings that go bad. I need to think, oh, even James Patterson puts up with this. So don't clear the record. Well, tell
Yeah.
us
Well,
a little bit about the premise of Project Z, because as you know, I'm a huge zombie fan.
yes.
Fortunately, I think I've got my zombies mostly behind me, although there might be another zombie story in me. We'll see. I'm
Yeah.
always curious in such a crowded marketplace.
Yeah.
How do you find a new angle on zombies? What's your take on zombies?
It's a good question. I'm not a zombie person. I'm not a particularly a sci-fi guy or a horror guy. I honestly can say I don't watch Walking Dead. It took
I
me.
don't anymore now that Rick and Carl are dead. Forget it.
Yeah, I do follow the death tally to some degree, but I haven't really been an active watcher of the show. But I wanted to write. I guess it started with an idea of a misplaced zombie boy trying to get through um, the typical middle school experience. It started with like I think I started with the premise of the ultimate outsider, and I just wanted to push the envelope on the outsider a little bit. And I came up with a name, Arnold B. Zombie, which was his original name, which has since changed a little bit to Arnold Z. Zombie after many discussions with my editors. And I just had an idea of plopping a 10 or 11-year-old zombie down in a typical fourth grade or fifth grade situation and and see what would happen, because I didn't want to follow particularly kind of the zombie tropes and the zombie rules that are out there, which I know exist, obviously, and there's a huge, and I did enough research to know that there is kind of accepted and unaccepted behavioral traits of zombies. I kind of wanted to invent some zombie rules of my own, and I got away with doing that by making the premise that the government, the U.S. It takes place slightly in the future, and the U.S. government has invented a race of zombies under this super secret Project Z that they are originally training to attack the United States, because the powers that be have decided that our country has become so fractured that we need to manufacture a common enemy, because the only thing that can bring us back together, that can unite the country, is having a threat to us all. And that's what these zombies are that's what these zombies are being created to do. And so this lab has been established to develop this line of zombies. And some people who work there are disgruntled and not happy with this plan. And so they help a group of zombies escape. And all are captured except this one little boy who makes his way out to the road ultimately, and is saved by this family. I don't want to say too much or get too bogged down, but this family is also connected. The mother is connected to the lab too, and she has kind of helped him escape. And so they take him in and try to pass him off as a human boy, and kind of train him in the ways of human fourth grade human behavior. And so there's a lot of there's no real typical zombie horror in this book. It's much more kind of comical, the ultimate fish out of water story. But hopefully it's also a little bit heartfelt and a little bit about how people with extreme differences all have much more in common than we might think. And as a result, in this day and age where people are a little bit more suspicious of the other than ever before, that aspect of the story hopefully will resonate with kids, even if they don't necessarily realize it.
And also, taken straight from the headlines, the idea of our government trying to gin up a terrifying enemy. Not that anyone would ever do that. I'm sure there are terrifying caravans headed toward us right as we speak.
Yeah,
But
yeah, it's kind of it's kind of the ultimate immigrant story, I guess. The last thing I want to do is be heavy-handed when I describe what this book is about, or in the writing of it, because I don't want to be just another guy, writing a metaphor about what's happening in the world today. But at the same time, I think there's a world in which, believe it or not, a fourth grade or a fifth grade community and culture can reflect what's happening in the world, the country at large, in its own way. A fifth grade class is a microcosm of everything else. So why
Well, the
not?
story is coming through you, the artist, right? And you live in the world. You can't
Yeah,
help but be a little bit impacted by it.
absolutely, absolutely. And so I keep all my moralistic messaging to a minimum, hopefully, and I keep it with a light touch. But so I guess I can't help myself and stick a little bit in there about what I wish society was like. And so if I can make my fifth grade universe that way, maybe that's my way of addressing it.
Well, my hat's off to you, sir. I once started to write a middle grade zombie story, and I think it
Yeah.
was chapter 3. They come across an overturned car with 2 zombies stuck in it, and there's a car seat in the back, the straps of which have been chewed through, and it's bloody and grizzled. I wrote that and was like, "This is a young adult novel. This is not middle grade. That's over."
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started the zombie book, Project Z, I thought it was actually going to be a like an early reader or a chapter book. I kind of intended it to be even for a slightly younger audience than it ended up being for. That was a conversation with myself and my editor kind of resulted in me aging it back up a little bit to middle grade. But I would say that the Project Z audience is probably slightly younger middle grade than the Charlie Joe Jackson audience, if I had to guess. And maybe Crimebiters sits right in the middle.
Let's talk about Crimebiters, because Fangs for Everything is newly available,
It
and
is.
viewers and listeners can get that today. So tell us the premise of Crimebiters.
I do. I happen to have a new, spanking new paper overboard right here. Crimebiters, I started writing, I guess, 2009, maybe 2015. I was wrapping up the Charlie Joe series. I'd written one standalone after Charlie Joe called The Real Us, which is a book that I am really quite proud of. This book right here, but I knew kind of my bread and butter was series writing, and I knew that I wanted to find another realistic fiction topic that I could write about, because I was always going to be, the zombie book notwithstanding, I've always been a realistic fiction kind of guy. I'm not. I don't write distant planets. I don't write books that take place in the future. And write about and dogs have always been incredibly important to me. There are dogs in the Charlie Joe has 2 dogs, and we adopted this dog named Abby. And we adopted her off the internet, which is always a little risky because you see a picture of a dog and you talk to people about what the dog is like, but you don't know really what that dog is like until you first get the dog. And when you adopt a dog off the internet, you pick it up at the side of the highway, literally, because they're coming from somewhere else. Abby came from Arkansas. We live in Connecticut. And when the dog gets off the truck, you take it home and you own the dog. There's no trial period. There's no nothing. And Abby was awesome right from the start, but she was also a little quirky, a little crazy. And she had this habit of sleeping a lot during the day and staying up a lot at night and wanting to go outside at night and wanting to prowl the neighborhood at night, and wanting to play with our other dog. And that, as I tell kids in school visits, you never know where your next idea is going to come from. You can sit down at a computer with the express purpose of coming up with 5 ideas for a story and fail miserably. And then it can be in the middle of the night and your dog can be driving you crazy and an idea pops into your head. And that's kind of what happened with Crimebiters. I had an idea of a boy adopting a dog, much like Abby. and this boy already has a hankering for vampires and a hankering for old cop shows, crime shows on TV. And through the combination of his imagination, his obsessions, and the quirky behavior of this dog, he becomes convinced that she has superpowers. And he ultimately forms a gang with his friends and Abby the dog, and they're called Crimebiters, and they solve crimes and ferret out bad guys in their neighborhood. So there's some action, adventure, and a little bit of mystery in it. But again, that's kind of a device and a vehicle for me to tell more stories about kids and their relationships with each other and their school environment and their parents and their friendships and a little bit of a crush here and there. And this particular series has the added complicating element of a possible superhero crime-fighting vampire dog, which may or may not be the case. I leave it up to the reader to decide what Abby truly is.
Is your dog a vampire?
She may be. You know what? I doubt it, but she has all the characteristics that led me to believe that someone could think their dog could be a vampire. She's a night dog. She's got long fangs. She has a streak of black fur down her back that one could say was cape-like. And it was enough for me to say I could see how an imaginative boy could think that a dog like Abby could be a superhero crime-fighting vampire dog. And that was all I needed to kind of be off and running. His friends, Jimmy's friends, right on cue, one of my dogs is barking. Jimmy's friends in the book think he's crazy and just has a wild imagination, and they think it's ridiculous that he thinks Abby has these superpowers, but he remains convinced. And so you see both sides of the story in these books. And my kids, again in the school visit, they want to know. They want to know if Abby is really a crime-fighting superhero vampire dog. And I say, it's up to you. It's up to the reader. As much as I, as a writer, can leave up to the reader, I do it. In the Charlie Joe Jackson series, in the earliest books, I never once said his age, and I never once said what grade he was in. I left that up to the reader. Because
extremely frustrating for those of us writing a review. Yes.
Do you remember that, actually?
Oh, yeah. I went back there. I'm sure he said it. I must have missed it. And I'm going to leave it out. And I finally I think I was ambiguous in the start of the review. Hey, boy. Charlie Joe Jackson.
Middle grade-ish. Yeah, I don't even remember if I said he was in middle school or elementary school. I should check. But I would do things where a class would have just read one of the Charlie Joe books, probably one of the early ones, and I would say, how old is Charlie Joe? And I'd hear 11, 9, 13. What grade is he in? 4th, 7th. And I think that's great. I think if kids, their imaginations allow them to come up with these answers, and they place these characters in these situations that work for them as the reader, then fantastic. It all of the above can be correct. So
does that broaden the appeal of the story as well by not assigning a specific age?
It might, although I think the style of the writing and the illustrations will ultimately make a 10-year-old pick it up and a 14-year-old probably not pick it up. But I think it can. I think it can help a little bit widen the range for kids who, if they saw if they're in 5th grade and they see that the kid's in 4th grade, that might be an immediate automatic no. And so if you leave that out, it's more plausible that he can be in 6th grade or 7th grade. And the language that I kind of give these kids, I think the goal is to make it wide enough so that a 4th grader can think he's my age, and a 6th grader could think he's my age, and hopefully that works.
I think I thought he was 35, which was very exciting for me when I read it.
He's my age.
Wow! Yes, I identify with his issues.
He's in the extended middle school plan. He's sorting it all.
I wanted to ask you about Crimebiters. In a situation like that,
Yeah,
where obviously the not the star of the show, but the one of the most interesting things is Abby, the superhero vampire dog.
yeah.
But Jimmy is the protagonist. How do you balance that and make sure that we're centered on our protagonist story without him being upstaged by the dog on the cover?
Oh,
Or do you
I
worry about
lost
him?
you for a sec.
Oh,
Rob, ask that last question again. I lost you for a second.
oh, okay. Um, I said it real smart too. Now I'm not going to be able to repeat it that way. I was asking about when you've got a situation like that where you've
Yeah,
got the dogs on the cover, the superhero vampire dog, but
yeah.
the protagonist is the relatable middle grade character Jimmy. How do you strike a balance between those two, and how
Uh,
do you keep the reader invested in both, or is it a concern?
it is a concern. It's mostly a concern. As I was going through the Crimebiters series, the premise book. I call the first book in every series the premise book because you can spend the first third or so of the book just setting up the premise, and then the latter part of the book making the story, your first story, kind of lead to, obviously ultimately lead to more books in the series. But in the first book, the premise and the story kind of have equal weight, and then by the time you're in the second book, you maybe recap the characters a little bit, a few pages, but it's all about the story. So in the first Crimebiters book, it was filled with Abby because the premise is he's trying to adopt a dog, and they go meet Abby at the shelter, and he becomes convinced that Abby is this quirky superhero crime fighting dog. And ultimately, he does make these friendships and forms this gang, but it's a lot about how he adopts Abby and what she means to him and how she gives him confidence. Because at the beginning of the first book, he's somewhat of a lonely kid. He has one friend, but it's about this boy and this dog kind of helping each other. But then by the time in the second book and then the third and the fourth book, you don't have to set up the premise so much anymore. And there's so many characters that I've developed in the series that my brain and my heart leads me to mostly tell stories about these kids. And so it was something that I had to be consciously aware of to make sure I gave Abby, the dog, enough to do and make sure that she felt like an integral part of the story. I had a couple conversations with my editor along the way about how I was straying too far from the original premise of the series, and she said basically what you just said, which is you have a dog on the cover, you have to make sure the dog has enough to do in the story. And so it was more a concern of Jimmy over tending to overshadow Abby than it was Abby tending to overshadow Jimmy. And when I say Jimmy, I don't mean just him. I mean the cast of human characters, his good friend Daisy, his good friend Irwin, the bully Baxter, who becomes a good friend of theirs. All of this stuff ultimately is what I'm most interested in. And Abby, I had to make sure Abby didn't just become a device. I had to make sure she had enough to do. I solved that in the third book by setting the mystery at an animal shelter, the animal shelter where Abby is adopted from, and so I was able to kind of bring the story back to the world of the animals and the dogs. But it was always a concern that I make sure that our cover girl got her due. So
I have some questions for the shelter. You didn't mention this dog sleeps in a coffin. You didn't. It never came up during the adoption process.
yeah, that's true. Although in the shelter, in the very first book, the dog is sleeping. It's the daytime, of course, but she's sleeping in the corner in the darkest, in a dark cage in the darkest corner of the whole shelter. And I don't know if you remember this, but it's explained away that she's her eyes don't adjust well to light, so she really loves the darkness. And there are a bunch of things that I explain in the first Crimebiters book uh, about Abby's vampirical tendencies that kind of they don't go away in the subsequent books, but I'm not as emphatic about proving her vampire tendencies in those books. She just becomes another member of their gang who is a crime fighter and who still has an uncanny knack to ferret out and chase down and capture bad guys on behalf of this gang of Crimebiters. But all the explaining about why she's a vampire is really done in the first book. And once I get that premise out of the way, I kind of leave it be and go on to other storytelling.
I have lots of questions for you on the back of that. One thing that comes to mind right away is, what is it that you think attracts children to crime fighter characters? You know, I'm standing in front of my collection of Batman toys here, and as I get older, more and more, I
Yeah.
think, if I had billions of dollars, am I really going to spend it all on an awesome car and go out and punch people in the face? I think I'd take some trips. I might have a real nice life. I mean, I would definitely have like a year there after my parents got shot as a kid.
Yeah.
Inconsolable. That would be a bad year. But then, like 3-4 years later, I'd be thinking, well, you know, I do have $1 billion. There are
Yeah.
ways I could cheer myself up.
Yeah, I'm doing quite well, actually.
But crime fighters are crime fighting stories, detective stories for kids
Yeah.
are pretty common. What is it you think that middle grade readers gravitate toward about crime fighters?
I think if there's a mystery involved, I never thought of myself as a writer of mysteries, but I'm finding that both with the Crimebiters series and with my standalone book, Game Changer, I found that having kids solve crimes and realize clues and putting a puzzle together to solve something along the way and simultaneously with the characters in the book is just a great way to propel a story forward. So I think there's the garden variety fascination with bad guys that I think people of any age have. Not everybody has it, but many do. I certainly do. I am a fan and have always been a fan of true crime stories, both reading, to get really to get morbid for a minute. I remember reading a book about Charles Manson when I was, in middle school, and just being like sickened and blown away, but also fascinated and captivated by the darkest nature of humanity and how people can human beings can go so dark. So I think there's an element of that in a much gentler way, of course, if told well, can resonate with children. But I also think that good fighting and triumphing over evil, and the process by which good has to go about solving these mysteries to ultimately triumph over evil, is a very satisfying, rewarding, ultimately uplifting answer to the darkest sides of our natures. Is that there's, for every dark person among us, there are many, many noble, right-seeking people trying to right those wrongs and ferret out those bad guys and bring them to justice. And it can, in a weird way, both remind people that not everything is a bed of roses in life, and there are obstacles and there are problems and there are bad people. But by and large, the good side and the good nature of humanity will triumph. But again, that sounds messagey, and none of that would matter if the yarn isn't good. So you have to spin a yarn that drops clues along the way, like breadcrumbs, and makes kids want to find out what happens, and give them just enough information so that, yeah, that makes sense, and then tease them with another element to the mystery, a cliffhanger, like we were talking about before with the old Batman series. All of these things, I think, combine into kind of this unimpeachable, indestructible form of storytelling that will, always be a huge part of both children's and adult popular culture and entertainment.
Makes sense to me. It's entirely practical to be looking out for the villains. That's one of the chief reasons I write horror when I'm not writing middle grade, because these
Yeah,
people walk amongst us. We know
they
that.
do.
Most of us are cool, but there's a couple of folks you've always got to be watching out for and learning to identify them as much as you
Absolutely.
can. That's just a matter of practical survival.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned that you want to make sure that you go above and beyond and make sure you've got a book good. At what point what is your process? How many drafts are you typically going through? And at what point do you start to feel, oh, I've got something here? Or is it always kind of a question until readers tell you later?
It is always a question. I mean, to answer that last question first, yeah, you never know. You can be out in the world and you're still wondering if anybody will care or if anybody will think it's any good. For myself, I start with a synopsis. I mean, the premise and the idea is always good, but unless I map it out in a 3-act synopsis, then I will probably. I used to try to write without mapping out a synopsis, and I would always get stuck. I would always have an interesting idea, start to write. Well, this was very early on when I was just beginning the process, and I realized pretty quickly that unless I map out some version of a beginning and a middle and an end in a 3-act structure, and I know where it's ultimately, hopefully, going to go, even though I know it will change a lot along the way, that gives me the security to keep going and to kind of fight my way through a first draft.
So do you know your ending going in then?
I know a version of the ending that will ultimately mutate to some degree. Sometimes it stays pretty close to what I've originally written up in a synopsis, and sometimes I've gone somewhere far afield. I do like to after a book is done, I will entertain myself by going back and looking at the synopsis and seeing how far afield I've gone. And sometimes I've gone into a whole other field, and sometimes I've stayed pretty close. But the idea of not knowing where my characters are going has always scared me, because it's any writer looks for any excuse to procrastinate and to stop. At least I certainly do. And so I don't want to have the excuse of not knowing what's going to happen next as a reason to stop. I want to make sure I eliminate that excuse from my tools of procrastination. And so I will always map out a 3 to 5 page plot summary, and then I wrestle my way through a first draft, knowing it could be terrible because I just want to spit it out on paper. So the first draft for me is the hardest, because even though I do have a synopsis, the storytelling still has to be developed, and creating scenes and propelling the plot along is challenging for me. The voice of the characters I write in has always been a more natural process for me and less difficult than making sure I have plots that are surprising and funny and new, because there's, you could tell yourself that every plot's been written, and you might not be wrong. So to find new ways to tell new stories is always a great challenge. And then I will always I'll immediately dive into a second draft before showing it to anybody, because the first draft is completely unshowable. And then by the time I've written the revision, the first revision, sometimes I'll start showing it to people at that point, an editor or an agent or a trusted family member who reads my stuff sometimes.
Do you use critique partners still at this point, or is it mostly?
I don't do that. I did have a critique group early on, and which was very valuable. But now I kind of have an unofficial brain trust. One of my kids, my oldest son Charlie, reads everything I write, usually pretty early in the process.
One of the boys for whom the boy who does not read was named.
Yes, absolutely, Charlie, Joe, and Jack. And they've all been they've all been a little bit more willing to read my stuff now than they were at the beginning. But another thing I will do almost always before I show it to anybody is I write on a computer, like most people do. But I'm a big believer that something will look different on a page than it will on a screen. So once I've written a second draft that I feel is semi-acceptable, I will print it out and do a whole revision on on a printed manuscript, and I will do it the old-fashioned way by scribbling revisions in the margins and Xing out stuff. And I feel like seeing the printed word on the page, just for some reason, it feels different, and it feels, I can see something in a printed draft that I'm like, how did I think this was good on the screen? And so I will often do that as my third draft, and then start to send it out into the world.
And do you read it aloud either to yourself or to someone else as well?
No, I don't do that. Every once in a while, I will, if there's a heavy dialogue scene, I might read a couple of passages out loud to myself, but it's just not a process, not a part of the process for me, by and large.
And when you're doing that first,
do you do that? Do you do
I've
that
tried
now?
it. I actually, the thing about, I love this this podcast because I love the guests that come on here, and I love the information that I get. My least favorite part of the podcast is me. If there was a way to cut me out of it, it would be so much more listenable later. So I won't record myself reading it. Occasionally I will read it out loud to a plant because they need their carbon dioxide. But no, I want people to read it far away from me. And when the audiobook, when it's time for the audiobooks, I let the narrator take care of it. Maybe one day before the end, I'll record one of my own audiobooks, but I hate the thought because then it would be the one audiobook of mine I couldn't listen to.
So have you had your books done on audio, and are you happy with how they've been read?
Oh, I'm thrilled with how they've been read, because I picked the narrator and I worked with him every step of the way, and we go back and forth, and I give him notes actively. I also learned a lot about diplomacy doing that. Fortunately, I've got a little bit of a background in theater, and I was originally a film student, so I directed movies and I've worked with actors before. So I have a little bit of sensitivity of what not to say. I still said the wrong thing a couple of times, but better than average. So yeah, that's a thrilling process, especially with like the Banneker Bones audiobook has been so helpful to me as I'm writing the 2 sequels, so I can go back and I can listen to how my words sound coming out of someone else's mouth. Okay, great.
I should do that. I haven't actually tried that. I have an audiobook on a lot of my books, but I haven't done that yet, which is interesting. It's funny. I just was starting to map out the synopsis of my third Project Z book. And I did something which I haven't done really before, which is read back the last third to myself of the second Project Z book. It kind of helped me figure where I think the story should. A lot of time compare synopsises of my books along the way. But this is the first time I've actually gone back and read the book before as a means to find inspiration for the synopsis for my next book.
Makes sense. I wanted to ask you, when you're writing a series, at what point in the process do you know that this is a premise book for a series versus this is a standalone?
That's a good question. When I wrote the first Charlie Joe Jackson book, since I didn't really know what I was doing,
best way to get it done.
Best way to get it done. My agent sent it and said, "Well, I'm going to try to get a 2-book contract out of this, and maybe the second book will be a sequel, and maybe it won't." And I said, "Wow, I said what anybody would say, which is great. Do what you have to do. I'd love to get my book published." And the book bought it as a you don't really call 2 books a series, but as a book and a sequel. And I didn't really know how that was going to work. I hadn't written the first book with a lead into a second story at all. It felt all encompassing to me when I had first written it. So when I found out there was going to be a sequel, I went back and kind of developed almost as if I was writing a new standalone book as opposed to a direct sequel. I mean, it had the characters, but Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Extra Credit could have been a first book in a series. It wasn't relying on anything that had happened in the first book. It's the premise of that one is that his grades are terrible and his parents are threatening him to send him to this academic summer camp unless he doesn't get his grades up. And so he joins all these extra credit things in school to try to get his grades up. And it was halfway through writing that second book where I think the numbers of the first book were promising enough that my publisher, Macmillan, told us that they were going to want a couple more Charlie Joe Jackson books past the second one, a third and a fourth. And they didn't know at that point how many. And so it was in the middle of writing the second book where I realized I need to figure out a way to make this kind of open-ended so that it could last, which is how I kind of came up with the idea of he having to go to this camp, and the third book then takes place in the camp. And then ultimately, I can't remember, 4 or 5 books in, I started really struggling with ways to keep these characters fresh, because when I first heard that this was going to be a sequel, I devised this whole kind of 5-book plan where each book would take place in the next grade up. This was how naive I was. And I said, well, this first book could be in 6th grade and then 7th grade, and then ultimately they'll graduate from high school. And again, it was one of those pat me on the head moments. And they're like, oh, Tommy, you don't know anything. That's not how this works. They
wouldn't try that today, not now that you're the Tommy Greenwald. Back then, they could get away with it.
No one's patting this guy on the head anymore. So they basically said, no, they're like cartoon characters. They don't age. They can age, they can refer back to something that happened a month ago or last year in school, but essentially, as long as we're telling the story of Charlie Joe Jackson and his friends, they're the same age. Now, the last Charlie Joe Jackson book does take place on the day of his middle school graduation. The whole book takes place on one day. And so at that point, the series is ending. I feel like, I can reveal that he's about to graduate from middle school. I can wrap everything up. But this was, this had been 9 books at this point, and struggling to find ways to tell about kids who are the same age for 9 books to me was a real struggle. Jeff Kinney's
on. At this point now, are you filled with regret and wish that you had left it open for more books yet to come?
I don't think so. I was done with it. I think the publisher had also felt that like enough was enough. It was a nice library of books. Jeff Kinney is writing his 13th and his 14th Wimpy Kids. God bless a guy who can keep characters fresh who are essentially the same age for that long. It's impressive. And Crimebiters is done with the 4 books. So Crimebiters was slightly different because I did know it was going to be a 3-book series kind of right off the bat. So I knew, but they were going to be kind of, since that was kind of a mystery series, I could just regenerate storyline through new bad guys and new crimes and new ways to solve these mysteries. I didn't have that luxury with Charlie Joe because there was no real mystery or adventure part to it. These were just kids living their lives. It was a little harder to come up with interesting storylines. These guys Crimebiters always have foils and they have villains, and so it was a little easier to kind of make that almost an anthology series because each story is its standalone mystery that they have to solve.
And are there? I'm just chuckling because you mentioned that Charlie Joe Jackson is 9 books in total, and I'm thinking, yes, for the reluctant reader who started early on, I don't want to read 8 books later.
Yeah, they've got a whole library of books.
You're a reader now, son.
I know you don't want to talk about it yourself, but you've written series too, and so you must kind of find some of the same obstacles I've dealt with. Some of the same challenges.
Kind of. With Banneker Bones, the idea was, I call it the and then story because there isn't really an ending. I'm working on the 3rd book now that will resolve quite a bit of things from the 2nd and 1st book, but leaving the door open for 4, 5, and 6 or however many. Eventually I'll expire and then that's it. We're done. But otherwise, it's an open-ended plan, and my thought there was, let's make a character that I know I'm always going to be interested in. And so it's Batman at age 11. There's a lot of distinctions, but it's very much here's our crime hero. There can always be another villain. I
Yeah.
will always be able to come up with somebody for Banneker Bones and Other Skullworth to fight against,
Yeah.
and ways to raise the ante. And so there, the important thing was in book one, just not to rule out future possibilities.
Yep. Yep.
Whereas with something like the Book of David, which is a 5-volume serial novel, that is one total story. I count it as 5 books, and you would too if you'd written and revised and re-revised it. I don't know how many drafts we did of each of those for 5 books. But it is one continuous story, which is why you can also buy the mega volume that if you drop it, it'll break your foot.
Did you map out that story in advance and kind of know where the book breaks would be?
I knew the ending. I'm a big fan of doing something I call it a grocery list. It's basically, okay, well, in order for, I usually have some idea of the ending. It doesn't always happen the way I foresee it. And in that case, the ending changed a little bit dramatically. Not that I could talk about it without spoiling. If I just wanted to tell you on a free podcast, I wouldn't have written 5 books. But because I knew the ending, I thought, okay, well, here's some major events that have to come along. And I decided relatively early on that it was going to be 5 volumes of serial. So I had to come up with 5 pretty good cliffhangers, or 4 pretty good cliffhangers, to make sure that we got you all the way to the 5th book, but also to make sure that each one was a little bit self-contained. They're the same characters on the same overall arc, but they have individual arcs and plots to be resolved within each volume of the series. And again, chapter 1 is available to download free as an ebook as you're listening to this.
Excellent.
So let's talk a little bit about Game Changer. I'm going to ask you about flying saucers. That's a little bit teaser. People get concerned at this point in the interview if I haven't asked my flying saucer question. Yeah. Rest assured, it's coming. But first, let's make them earn it. Let's talk about a sports book, because I'm terrible with sports. If there's one thing that terrifies me, it's the idea of writing a sports novel. In fact, and altogether now, I made the character a baseball player just to force myself to write in a little bit of sports. Plus, I figured if he was good with the bat, you got zombies coming at you. You don't want to have those bat skills.
Yeah.
So what is the secret to a good sports book? How do you make sports interesting for readers that maybe don't like sports, or for sports fans who don't like readers or reading?
Reading, yeah. It's a good question. I have always loved sports. My kids love sports. But that does not mean that I will say, I'm often asked what I read as a kid, and I did read Matt Christopher books as a kid, which are, he was Mike Lupigo before Mike Lupigo. Obviously, he wrote tons of sports books. There's still books coming out, I think, under the Matt Christopher line. So I have a history of the idea of writing a sport in my mind. While I was writing this batch of O's and Crimebiters. But I knew after I'd finished the Crimebiters series that I wanted to write something that had a different tone to it, that was a little bit more serious, had a little bit of intensity to it. I loved writing quote unquote funny books, humorous books, and I hope they are funny and humorous. But I wanted to challenge myself, get out of my comfort zone a little bit. And again, my family has always been my inspiration, both human and animal. And as I said, sports were a big part of my life growing up, and they were a big part of my kids' life. And going to my kids' sporting events was a big part of parenting for me. And I tell kids when I talk about Game Changer that I have found that sports are the ultimate complicated subject. Especially football. One of my sons played football. And by that, I mean that every writer looks for a subject where there's 2 sides to the story, because it's a challenging thing to write about a polarizing event or a polarizing subject, and being balanced about it. And to me, football and youth sports was the ultimate complicated subject, because there are great things and there are things about it. I love the game of football. I love watching my son play football, but it was an ambivalent. It was a love that was and is filled with ambivalence, because there's so much bad about youth sports and about football and about youth football, combining those two things. There's the obvious, which is the danger, just the safety of it, the danger of it. Football has action, which is great, but football has danger and safety issues, which is kind of inexcusable. So that was one complicator. Another complicator was the fact that the bonding and the friendships and the team building, and this is not just for sports. This can be your dance troupe. This can be your acting, your drama department. This can be your cheerleading team. This can be the band you're in. The importance of social interaction and bonding and friendships and team building among kids in middle school and elementary school and high school is incredibly important. But that can be poisoned with peer pressure and hazing and ways that these teams are built that are completely unhealthy. And I did a lot of research about how older kids on sports teams make younger kids do things, some of which are funny and are typical, but some of which veer off into the fraternity hazing type world that can be very dangerous and very scary, not just for college kids, but imagine it in high school and in middle school, and it does happen. And finally, the idea of teaching kids how to win and lose gracefully at a young age is a because life is filled with winning and success, and it's important to know how to handle failure. And these are life lessons that you can take with you, hopefully, for a long, long time. But the extent of the emphasis on winning versus losing and winning at all costs that is part of youth sports at an incredibly young age is relentless and dangerous. And it's brought on by the kids themselves, the pressure they put on themselves. It's brought on by their parents, who are so intense and so desperate for their kids to succeed and triumph. It's brought on by coaching. It's brought on by the money-making apparatus that is youth sports now, which is such an incredible money suck, and parents feel compelled to spend so much money to give their kids the best coaching and the best training and the best this and the best that. It's huge. It's huge business, youth sports now. And so, and coaching, while coaching, coaches can be the most influential, positive impact on kids' life. There are many, many instances out there where coaches just go way too far and talk to kids in a way that no other adult would be allowed to talk to children in any other aspect of life. But because it's sports and because it's coaching and because it's football and because it's winning and losing, these adults get away with talking to these kids this way. So, all of these things made me think that it was a ripe topic to write about, which is why I ended up writing this book, Game Changer. The premise of which is a boy who he's about to become a freshman in high school. It's the summer before his freshman year, and he's trying out for the high school team, and he's a budding superstar player, and he gets terribly injured in this training camp. And he himself spends almost the entire book in a coma in the hospital. And the entire book is about his friends and his family and the community trying to nurse him and encourage him back to health, but also to figure out what exactly happened, because you think it's a standard football injury at the beginning of the book, but over the course of the book, it becomes clear and clues come out that something else happened. There was more at play that led to his injury. And those elements are where I try to attack some of these complicated subjects. That was a long-winded answer, but that's essentially it.
No, people that want to write their own sports. No, I feel like a serial killer when I talk about sports. In fact, I'm in. We were talking about bad coaches. I'm in Indiana, where Bobby Knight is still considered great by many of my fellow Hoosiers. Oh, what a great man! He did what he had to do.
Absolutely.
or so
I
to
mean,
speak, popular opinion.
you know,
But every when
Bobby
I
Knight
was
coached in a different time where things weren't quite talked about the way they are talked about now, and some of the things he did in this day and age of social media and Twitter and all this stuff, I think he couldn't get away with now. I will say that.
I think that's true.
Yeah,
I think he'd been bounced out year one, year two.
yeah, probably. Certainly, the throat around the kid's neck would have been one of them,
Or
right?
maybe it would have saved him from himself.
That's true. That's true. Anyway, so it was very exciting writing this book, and it's getting some nice responses out there, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah, I got to a point in my life where when I was in high school, there were some middle grade show, but I'll go ahead and say this. There were two things it was not okay to admit to. One was still being a virgin, and two was not liking sports. You had to,
Really?
go Colts, go Horse. We love our Colts, we love our Pacers.
Yeah,
And
sure.
then by the time I got to college, I was still doing it. And then, so long as nobody ever asked a follow up question, I was good. But if somebody did, what do you think of such and such a player? I'd be like, who now? Oh, what's this?
You know
And I
what's
finally just stopped with it. But that's when I think of serial killers, I think back to me talking to people about sports. That must be what that's.
but the athletes in school being the kings of the hill, that has never changed, and that will never change. They're still the ones who are looked up to, revered, put on pedestals, can get away with behavior and get excuses for behavior. And it's kind of fascinating. It's an aspect of human nature that the kind of athletic among us are put in this protected place that is just ingrained in our nature and society. Because as much as life and society and culture has changed over the years, that one thing, I think, if you looked at a middle school and high school approach to quote unquote nerds versus quote unquote jocks, you could go into a school in 1957, 1997, and 2017, and the dynamic would essentially be exactly the same.
And it strikes me as odd. You would think that would be changing because I was thinking about the one of the biggest nerds that I knew in high school
Yeah.
now owns 3 or 4 different businesses. I
Yeah.
see him on TV advertising on a regular basis, and I think about
Yeah.
all the young ladies that weren't interested in him. They were talking to the football player that's now working at the factory. And it's
Yeah.
like, you could have got in on the ground floor. You would
I
be
know, but
Mrs. Three
kids
business
never
owner now.
learn. Kids never learn. They're not looking into the future that way.
Or Mister Three business owner, because I know some very successful girls from high school as well, but I played right to the stereotype. Terrible of me. Um, with why do you have a theory as to why that is? As to what the worship is? It just straight because we still have caveman brains and we want to make sure that we're with the person that can best fend off the
I
lions
think
that come to the edge of the cage?
I think that's
Or
part of
cave.
it. I do think that's part of it. I mean, I've seen studies where, you know, people, men usually 6'1" and above are more successful in business than men 5'9" and below. It's just like part of it is just pure physicality and people's reactions to each other's physicality. That I think you hit the nail on the head. It's something that's ingrained in the human brain from day one. It's like the bigger they are, the more protected we feel, it's a good question. I just think people don't have to try as hard to understand the virtue of the athletic as they do to understand the virtue of the artistic. It's just an easier thing for people to go, oh my God, look how fast that person can run, or look how high they can jump, than to say, wow, did you hear the way that kid played that Bach fugue on the cello? That was amazing. It's not something that the 13, 14-year-old brain can necessarily lock into. So whatever impresses a young person the most and the easiest will continue to be the most powerful way to separate kids, juveniles, by status. And that, unfortunately, the brilliant cello player will never quite get the same response from his peers or her peers as the amazing basketball player will. I don't see that ever changing.
Well, here's hoping that now that we're in the information age.
Here's hoping.
Here's hoping. It could get better. And now, because I went straight to the stereotype, I feel compelled to point out that my cousin, Sabrina Doolin, was a football player professionally. She's the tough one in the family, and now she runs the Indiana Fear Farm, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest. I know she's won a bunch of awards, but one of the biggest horror houses that runs every year. In October, you can go through her haunted barn. She's got a haunted hayride. She used to terrify me as a child. So when people ask me, why do you write scary things? It's a complicated answer. But one reason is because my cousin, who used to come over and hide in my closet late at night and whisper while I was trying to sleep, "This is a ghost. Go out to the kitchen. Don't tell anyone I'm back here, or I'll kill your brother." Really creepy stuff. She used to terrorize me, so I got professionally haunted from a very young age. That has spiraled me off into a career as a horror author now.
So she's always been interested in scaring the bejesus out of people.
But that one goes against two stereotypes at once. So I wanted to make sure I threw her out there as an example, because she is a jock who is absolutely a successful business person, and of course she is an unstoppable female. That I wish I had her discipline and her talent. All right. Well, people sat through the sports talk, so as promised, let's not let them down. The Tommy Greenwald. Do you have an opinion on flying saucers, and have you seen one?
I have not seen a flying saucer. I don't have a strong opinion on. You mean whether they exist or not?
Absolutely.
What's that?
Yes. Yeah. Do you think they exist, and do you think they're a concern for practical Americans?
I wish I thought they existed, because it would show I have a much better expanse of imagination and the possibility of wonder. Sadly, I think I'm rooted in a more mundane form of reality that would lead me to believe that flying saucers do not exist. However, I do believe that there is functioning life in this universe in places other than Earth, for sure.
They're just not coming here yet.
Not yet. I'm trying to have it both ways, hedging my bets, but I find it almost impossible to believe that Earth is the only planet or only organism that has solved the issue of life. There's got to be other examples of it out there somewhere.
The only way that makes sense to me, and those who listen to Tuesday's episode with Daniel Kenny, I heard us go way into the weeds on this subject, where I admitted that I'm 60 to 70% certain that reality might be a computer simulation. I don't know that. I just think it's a distinct possibility. And in that situation where you're using up all your gigabytes right here, simulating Earth, it makes sense that you wouldn't put any life on those other planets and keep them far out there where we can't venture out.
Yeah. I will say that if my hunch is that we will be the first to find other life before other life finds us. That is my guess.
Well, now for those people who are frustrated, like, he's talking to the Tommy Greenwald. Why is he wasting his time with tabloid nonsense? Okay, well let's move on to talking about writing humor for kids, because you are extremely funny. Your books made me howl.
Thank you. Thanks.
And it's surprising to me to hear you say that you do plan relatively meticulously. You said about a 5-page outline.
Yeah.
How do you then go back and find the humor? Is it what strikes you on the day? Is it layering it back in after the fact?
It's a good question. I think the circumstances within the books and the premises within the books will only get you a quarter to a third of the humor that you're looking for. All the rest has to be in the voices of the characters and the way that my narrators are describing the events. And I cheat a little bit too, because I have figured out a way in my Charlie Joe series and my Crimebiters series to have these asides, where in the Crimebiters series they're called facts, and I can probably quickly find a fact in here. They run throughout the books. Fact, when I grow up, I want to live in a bakery. They always have something to do with what's happening in the story. But they're always hopefully little jokes unto themselves. And so to me, I consider that a little bit of a cheat because it's a way for me to make a funny comment without having to rely on it being within a character or within a plot device. It's like, let's take time out for this quick joke. And now back to our regularly scheduled book.
So you're guaranteed, even if you write nothing funny within the chapter itself, you've already got that up front?
Yeah, I got a couple jokes ready to go. And the voices of my characters, I think Charlie Joe is kind of a wise guy. Jimmy Bishop he's the Crimebiters guy. Jimmy Bishop is less of a wise guy, but he's making funny observations about the world around him. For some reason, that's the part that has always come most naturally to me. Writing in a wise alecky kind of way that hopefully adds a little bit of wit and comic commentary to the situations that are happening. I've definitely written books that are slapsticky and ridiculous. I have one of my Charlie Joe books, Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Making Money, is filled with money. He has a dog walking business that goes horribly awry. He throws himself a pseudo bar mitzvah to get gifts, and that goes horribly awry. So physical situations, there's a fight between Abby the dog and Daisy's cat Perkins in one of the Crimebiters books that takes place at a birthday party. Everything's trashed, and physical comedy and kind of slapstick, broader comedy is certainly a part of my books, but it's not where most of the comedy comes from. Most of the comedy comes from a certain attitude and point of view toward life that my characters have that can kind of hopefully find the funny in every situation.
That makes sense to me. And were you the class clown? Were you a funny kid?
I probably was the class clown to some extent. I would often, I don't have a lot of memories as a kid because I don't remember. My memory in general is not that great. I remember having an argument with myself if I was in class and a teacher was pontificating and I was negotiating, should I say this thing that I know will make kids laugh, but it will also make my teacher angry and possibly get me in trouble? And that negotiation would 99% of the time would end with me making the comment because the laugh was more important than the possible repercussions. And if you grow up always thinking that the laugh is king and getting the laugh is the most important thing, and if something bad can happen to you as a result of that laugh, well then so be it. Then that's an important trait for someone who wants to write comic novels needs to have, because the laughter and finding the funny, it always has to be king. It's always top priority. And and teaching how to, there are a lot of classes out there about writing comedy and writing comic television or writing comedy for books or movies. I'm not completely convinced that it's something that can be quote unquote taught because, again, I think it's something that's ingrained in you from an early age, your earliest consciousness. If the laugh is important to you, that you're willing to risk everything to get it, then it's your top priority, and then you're ready to kind of step into the comic ring, so to speak.
That makes sense to me. I'm always curious because I am a little bit funny, and of course, the moment you say that, you stop being funny. That's over now. But Banneker Bones. Not me, but Banneker Bones is a funny book. And when I see that humor, I know that part of that is just because it was a survival skill from the time I was young, because I was not an athlete. I was not physically gifted as a child. And that was my way of getting the bullies on my side, was that if I get them laughing, nobody gets too mad at somebody that makes them laugh on a regular basis.
Absolutely. I think that's another time-honored tradition. Speaking of athletes put on a pedestal, is learning how to deal with the bullies and learning how to deal with the intimidators. And I've often found that laughter is the best way for, as you said, a scrawny or a unathletic kid to win over the intimidators. It's also the best way for a short, nebbishy guy to get a girl that he thinks is way out of his league to pay attention to him, which worked for me personally, by the way.
Oh, me too. Anybody that ever checks out my wife online has the same question: why? How?
Why? How? I'm sure laughter had something to do with it. Your ability.
14 years later, I'm still making her chuckle. It worked out.
Do not underestimate the power of making somebody laugh. It is one of people's most appreciated traits, and it's what people so appreciate in others. If they feel that someone makes them laugh, they will forgive a lot of other flaws or faults they might have.
And are you a performer? I know we get to talk a little bit about Broadway now. I wanted to make sure I didn't fail to bring this up, because you have written John and Jen, a musical that has, is it still playing? I know it was revived recently.
Well, the original off-Broadway run was in 1995, so more than 20 years ago, obviously almost 25 years ago. But it still does get done. It gets done around the country pretty regularly. It gets done internationally to some degree. It had a revival in New York City a couple of years ago. I was never an actor. I've never been before the cameras or on stage, but I work in the theater business. I do advertising for Broadway shows, almost exclusively Broadway shows, which is very fun and very entertaining. It's also very stressful because I don't know how much you know about Broadway or your fans will know about Broadway, but Broadway is a tough business to make it in. Three quarters of all shows fail and lose their money. So when you have a product who has long odds of success, it can get pretty stressful, and the producers can get pretty stressful. But when you have a show that hits and is a incredibly successful creative piece and is successful commercially, that's the greatest thing in the world. But a lot of times we're trying to sell shows that people don't necessarily want to see, and that can be frustrating and challenging.
So a bunch of questions on the back of that. People don't know this about me, but I am a huge Broadway fan. If I could be anything other than a writer, it would be a performer, and not like a stoic Hoosier that maybe would sing in Oklahoma if it was absolutely required. No, cover me in glitter. I want to do Starlight Express. Put on some roller skates. Let's do this. That's in my heart, but the body will not allow. I do not have the talent. Anytime I've sung, and now my son, who I've been singing to since he was a baby, he's now 5. He's asking me politely, "Daddy, can we just listen to the computer sing the song?" Fair enough. So it's not in the cards for me. It's fine. I'm having a nice life. But how does writing a book differ from writing a musical? And also, how does that? Well, let me start with that, and I'll ask you my second question after.
It's a good question. Since I haven't written a musical in a long time, it's hard for me to say craft to craft. But the one thing I will say is that creating a piece of theater, especially musical theater, is the most collaborative kind of artwork collaboration there is. You're not only writing with the in my case, I wrote the book and the lyrics, and my good friend Andrew Lippa was the composer of the music for John and Jen. And that's the initial collaboration. And then you go out and you go to a director and you collaborate with them about how to shape the material. And then the director brings in designers, and the whole physical aspect of the show is created. And then you get the actors, and every step of the way you're adding people to the collaborative process. And it's a social collaborative event. Whereas the process of writing essentially is one of isolation, as we all know, I know. people who are watching this and our writers know, it's basically between you and your computer, or you and your pad and pen, if you are still a romantic, old-fashioned writer that way. It's not something that is collaborative until you feel like the work is, if not done enough to show to the world. So you're not bouncing your work off your partner all along the way. And even though I haven't written a show in 20 some odd years, because I really kind of, after that show was written, I focused on my career and other things I was working on. I can still feel and I still miss that active collaboration. And it's as rewarding and wonderful as writing novels has been, writing children's novels has been. The one thing it hasn't given me is that beautiful active collaboration, because even if you're collaborating with your editor, it's emails going back and forth at a glacial pace and an editor's note coming in. It's not a day after day sitting in the same room banging out the material kind of collaboration that the theater is. And that is something that if I ever get to write another show, I will be thrilled to get back to that collaborative process.
And then, I'm now caught up in the dream of how wonderful that must have been, working back and forth and writing a musical.
It is. It's kind of old-fashioned, and there's movies about great collaborative teams, and there's a lot of great show business movies like The Bandwagon, where you see them hammering out a show. And it really is. We off into your room, and your partner's on the piano, and you're sitting at a desk, and you're throwing bat and stuff back and forth in real time. It's exhilarating.
It's one of those strange moments, we'll say, in my marriage is my wife did not know how much I loved musicals until we took a trip to Las Vegas. She's like, "Oh, look at all these wonderful shows we can go see." I said, "Phantom, we're going to see Phantom." She's like, "Okay, if you want to see that." And she sat there kind of like this. Yeah, the dancing is nice. They're doing a lot of great stuff with the special effects. And she looks over at me, and I'm just bawling all over myself. The Phantom is so misunderstood. Why won't Christine take this chance with him? Oh.
How was the Phantom in Vegas? Because it's very different from how it was on Broadway. I didn't know that.
It was. In some ways better, in some ways less good. The costumes were certainly a little bit more risque and showgirl style for for a Vegas show. But the special effects were a bit more than they could pull off at the Murat Theater here in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
And so there's somebody that won't be sponsoring.
Are you in Indianapolis?
I am.
So you see shows, the Broadway shows that come through on tour, right?
As often as I can, absolutely.
What have you seen anything lately that you've really liked?
Since the birth of my son, I have not seen. So for about 5 years now, I have not gotten to see a good show. So something that needs to get back on there. Plus, but I have seen both Carl Anderson and Ted Neely perform Jesus Christ Superstar separately and once together. And
really?
Just my little heart. Oh, yes.
What did you think of the Jesus Christ Superstar NBC live broadcast? You must have watched that, right?
I thought John Legend did a wonderful job as Jesus. I wasn't crazy about the lack, really, of much of a stage. I thought they took a lot of departures on the songs that I wasn't crazy about. And the Judas didn't do it for me. And for me, that musical is Jesus is in the title, but Judas is the star. And that's what I'm looking for.
A lot of people loved him. You didn't love him?
I didn't. But we're talking to a guy who occasionally watches stuff on TV, not great theater critic who knows things.
he was just in the Rent live too. The same guy. I don't know if you saw that, but the guy who played Judas was in that.
I haven't seen Rent live yet. It's on my list. Well, question I wanted to ask you specifically, because you're working in advertising.
Yeah.
How does that translate to help you marketing your books? What tips are you able to learn on the Broadway side that you bring over to the publishing side?
Sure, that's a good question. Well, the advent of social media is huge in both places, as you yourself know, who have brilliantly branded your website and made it an essential part of the middle grade writing community. Mazel tov to that, by the way.
Well, thank you.
And in my day job, social media too has become, an essential part of branding any Broadway show. It has to have a pretty significant, not just paid advertising on places like the New York Times website or Broadway websites, but every show has to have a significant social profile on and create content for their social profiles, their websites, their Facebook feeds and their Twitter feeds and Instagram. I think authors, some cotton to it better than others, but every author realizes that if you can master that frontier and create a social footprint for yourself, it can really help you get the word out to your either your readers directly or to teachers and parents and educators and librarians. I myself have a kind of ambivalence about that. If I have something to say about my books, I will usually say it on Facebook and Twitter. Like if there's a good piece of news, but I'm not a natural drum beater in that regard. So I won't relentlessly stay in a Twitter conversation. I won't spend an enormous amount of time trying to build up my social media profile through community building and posting and tweeting and stuff. Partly, I tell myself it's because I don't have a lot of time to do it, but the fact of the matter is, I could make time to do it if I made it a priority. And it's entirely possible that even though I am the Tommy Greenwald, I'd be the Tommy Greenwald if I was a little bit more aggressive about my social media marketing, because I think that's really the only way a writer can market their own books. And most writers are if not solely responsible for marketing their own books, then responsible for the lion's share of it, because the truth is publishers have limited marketing budgets, limited press budgets. They do what they can. But if you're not one of their superstar authors, they're not going to spend an enormous amount of money or time to try to promote you and to try to get your stuff out there. It really is up to the writer to do that legwork. So I am aware of that, and I try to maintain at least some social media presence. And I also try to do school visits when I can, and I try to I run around the country sometimes at the behest of my publishers and or at the behest of Scholastic is my trade publisher for Crimebiters and for my Project Z series coming up. But I also have worked with Scholastic Book Fairs quite a bit, and they've been a fantastic advocate for me and my books. And they will send me out on school visits, and I always say yes, because I think it would be idiotic not to. Those aren't paid gigs, but they pay the expenses, and it's incredibly important for me to have Scholastic Book Fairs out there helping me build my brands. So that's a relationship that's been very helpful to me and helpful to my brand, I think, to a certain extent. But what really exists in both Broadway and children's literature and many, many other forms of popular culture is the fact that as much as you can promote your books or advertise your books or talk up your books or post about your books, ultimately it will be the consumer that decides whether you live or die, and it will be the word of mouth, and it will be grassroots organic building from the ground up, which starts with the viewer on Broadway. It starts with the reader for an adult novel. It starts with the child in the fifth grade classroom for a children's book author. If that kid reads a book and says to his neighbor at the next desk, I just read this great book, you got to read it, then you're off and running. Because as much as any one person can do, it's the word of mouth, and it's the product itself, and it's the consumer themselves that are the ultimate decider. And it's that way in, as I said, in children's literature and on Broadway and every other popular cultural place in between.
So on that logic, then how much time, in your opinion, should authors be spending ensuring their book is the absolute kind of book that would be shared, that people would be excited about, versus talking about it after the fact? And how do you divide up your time between the two?
It's a good question. I've heard a lot of agents and editors say the right thing, which is don't try to write to trends. Write what you want to write what you believe in, and the rest will take care of itself. And I think that's good advice to give, and I think that's what they should be saying. But whether I think that's completely true or not, I'm not sure. I think it's smart to try something you're interested in, just because you think it might sell or be popular. But if you're keeping an eye on what's out there and giving the lag time, knowing that the lag time will be anywhere from 1 to 3 years before anything you're writing will be seen by the public anyway. I have no, when I started my Crimebiters series, the first thing that made me think about that series was my first approach to it was going to be that it was going to be a send-up or a satire of all the popular aspects of children's books. I was going to have a dog in it. I was going to have a vampire theme line. I don't know if you read the first Crimebiters book, but he has this blotch on his face for much of the first part of the book. It's like this nervous kind of birthmarky type blotch that ultimately goes away. That was kind of an inside joke because Wonder was popular at that point. I was kind of throwing everything in as an inside joke. And at one point I said to my editor, everybody's going to get that I'm kind of satirizing everything that's popular in children's literature. And she was like, no, that's ridiculous. No one's going to get it. Just write us a good story. And I was like, oh, okay. But I was keeping an eye on what I thought was trending in children's literature, and I don't think there's anything wrong with keeping an eye on what's trending in children's literature. And if there's a way to marry the story you want to tell with things that you might think will resonate with readers, do it. I do it.
Why would you not want to know what your potential audience is interested in reading?
Why would you not? And I think it's great to say, write what you want and the rest will figure itself out. But nobody works in a vacuum. It's not entirely practical to think that, oh, I'm interested in carbon engines from the 1400s, so I'm going to write a children's book about that. Make sure that there's a market for that first. And that's an absurd example, and there's probably no such thing as a carbon engine from the 14th century. But just make sure, if you can, that what you want to write dovetails somehow with what you think A, will sell in the marketplace, and B, will ultimately be enjoyed and advocated for by the great decider, who is the consumer, who is the child reading the book.
I have so many more questions for you, but I'm watching the clock here, and I know we're coming toward the end of our time, tragically. But I do want to make sure I've got a fiction workshop here at the Indiana Writers Center. 10 students right now. We'll be offering another workshop soon. So if you're in the Indiana area,
Nice.
head to the indianawriterscenter.com or go to middlegradeninja.com and sign up for future classes. We've got one coming up here March 3rd, March 10th. Shameless ad, but the reason I bring that up is because I've started outsourcing some of these questions. I mean, you know what would be great is if I got the people who watch and listen to the show to tell me what they want me to ask the Tommy Greenwald. So these are a couple of questions that pulled from the Contenders, is the name
Okay.
of the workshop. And they want to know that your website says you historically enjoyed grown up in parentheses fiction, such as Catch 22, Letting Go, The Magus, and so on. Do you find it challenging to write for a young audience, given that that is your preferred literature? And do you read middle grade books for? You read middle grade books for fun too, as well, don't you?
Yes, I do. I read for fun is a strong word. I enjoy them and think they're fun, but would I read them if I wasn't writing it? Maybe here and there. Especially, I have a couple of friends who are writers. I would read their books. I love that. Gosh, my website. I wonder. My website isn't a complete embarrassment, by the way. I used to have one, and then I got revamped, and I'm not even sure what's on there now. But speaking of social media footprints, I should look into that.
That's TommyGreenwald.com.
It is TommyGreenwald.com.
Well, we're advertising it.
I will say that I think my bio, the last line of my bio on Amazon or various places is, for woefully outdated information about Tommy, please visit TommyGreenwald.com, because that does about sum up what's on there. But I will say, it's never, people have said, are you going to write an adult novel? And do you want to write an adult novel? And my answer is maybe, but I first wrote my first book kind of for and about my kids. And it was a natural fit for me to write stories in the voice of 11 and 12-year-old kids. And it feels completely separate from the fact that I read and have enjoyed adult novels, and still probably, if I were to pick up one for purely entertainment, it would be an adult novel. I think there is a way to absorb the writing of novels written for adults that you can incorporate into how you attack novels written for children with pacing. And for me, dialogue is very important. I tend to prefer books with a lot of dialogue, adult books or kid books, because I think as a reader, I'm more interested in eavesdropping on conversations than I am listening to the ruminations of either the narrator or the novelist. And it feels like a more natural way to be told a story. So I haven't found it challenging to separate my interest in adult novels for writing children's novels, but I have found it helpful. And I think any reading, every writer will say this, and every student has been told this, but it doesn't matter what you read. If you want to write, you have to read all sorts of different kinds of things, because there will be stylistic tips and things through osmosis that you pick up without even realizing it. The more you read, the better you'll write. That's an old cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. It's really true.
Chuckling about a critique partner of mine who I won't name, but he was struggling with one of the romantic subplots in his adventure book.
Yeah.
And I said to him, gosh, if there was only some ginormous genre completely devoted to the issues that you're having, so you could go out and check that might be helpful.
That could be helpful. Could be there. You never know.
Another question from the Contenders on the back of that one. Do you find yourself having to edit or revise down for a younger voice? And what tips do you have that writers can employ to go and do likewise?
To do what? What was the last thing you said?
What tips do you have so that we can also make sure that we're writing age-appropriate prose?
Oh, I see. It's a good question. I always do when I'm rewriting something I've written. I make sure I do a vocabulary check, and I will say that anything you do, you get better at as you do it. It could be cello, it could be basketball, it could be tap dance. So I think my ability to voice my characters in an age-appropriate way has gotten a lot better over time. I still love Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading as much as any of my books. It's the book that got me published. But if I go back and look at it now, I think there's writing in it that I wouldn't do today, because there's some vocabulary that there's some turns of phrases, there's some word choices that just don't feel quite realistic to me and don't really pass the smell test for how a 11 or 12-year-old kid would write. And I'm much more vigilant about that now. I really try to make sure that everything in my books and everything in the dialogue scenes that I write and the lunch table conversations passes that smell test. I will say in Project Z, I cheat a little bit because one characteristic of these zombies is that they're very, very smart and they have big vocabularies. So a running joke in that book is that Arnold, who's the main character, is using vocabulary words that nobody else in his peer group can understand. And that's kind of my little way of tweaking and kind of making fun of that aspect of children's books, because I've read children's books, lauded children's books, which have vocabularies that I'm just not quite sure. I'm like, this doesn't feel natural to me about how, if it's a first person book, I'm not completely convinced that I'm listening to how a 12-year-old would tell you something. And I think that's something with that exists. Every novelist struggles with that, because there are certain times where a word would help you tell that story, and you can't use that word because it's just not age appropriate, and you have to find another way in. And that's something that I've become much more aware of as I've written more books.
So when you scan for that, do you have like a program that you use to scan your manuscript?
No,
Just up there.
That's the
Years
program.
of being the Tommy Greenwald have formed a indispensable supercomputer.
I could probably thumb through Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading in like 2 seconds and find a sentence, like the word constantly, and the little sister of the host constantly coming in and out, supposedly to see if the chip bowl needs refilling, to make sure that nobody had overdosed on potato chips and was projectile vomiting on the couch. I'm like, half those words I'm not sure I would write today, because I'm not sure that a 12-year-old boy would really say that. So, but I didn't know what I was doing when I wrote Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading. I got lucky that people seem to like it anyway.
It panned out.
It did pan out, but I look at it now and say to myself, my editor, I remember having conversations with my editor early on too about it. And she was, as most say, that you want the vocabulary to be a little aspirational, and you want words in there that they might not understand, so they'll ask their teacher or their parent or look it up, which I totally get. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a few aspirational vocabulary words in there. But some of the writing, just when I read it, it feels like a 45-year-old guy trying to be funny rather than a 12-year-old boy telling a story. And so that I've tried to wean myself away from over the years.
Yeah, it's something that I find coming up in workshops repeatedly. Like, a character that's a modern teenager who can't wait to watch Clueless. Oh yeah, no, that's a modern teenager. That's not somebody that grew up in the 90s.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I tell you what, there are a bunch more questions from the contenders. I'm going to limit it to one because I think we've covered most of the others through our conversation, and they can get their own podcast.
Absolutely.
Then, so one question from them, and then one from me, and we'll call it a day.
Yeah.
The question from the contenders is why. I'm going to read this exact so I make sure I get it correct. Why write? Why not plumbing, engineering, medical or law school, real estate, etc.? What's storytelling about? What's the itch writing scratches where other careers don't? Being a writer is such a brutal occupation, yet so many people are drawn to the craft. Are we all insane? Why do you do it, Tommy Greenwald?
Yes, we all are insane.
End of podcast. There we go.
I probably would plumb. There's a lot of things out there that you don't want me anywhere near. So I do, stay in your lane is kind of a funny but getting overused expression. But there are so many things that I'm not good at that once I work my way around the things that I could do a little bit, I decided to stick with it. And if you're going to be a writer like myself, I've had a day job during my entire novel writing career. I still have it. I do it. I'm more part time on my day job than I used to be. But there are the very few among us who can turn themselves over completely to their writing lives and support themselves and support their family. So I approached it originally as a fun hobby I was picking up, like somebody else might golf or somebody else might join the community band. And then as the books started to happen and I started to get lucky and get contracts, I realized that I had this calling to entertain children, get kids to read who might otherwise not want to read. As the emails started coming in from kids, the most rewarding ones were those ones that said, I didn't think I liked reading, but I read your Charlie Joe book, and then I read the others, and grateful parents who would tell me that their kids didn't read until they read Charlie Joe or Crimebiters. And that's when I realized it was more than just a lark or more than just a hobby. There was something important is way too pretentious a word, but there was something incredibly rewarding in the fact that something I was enjoying doing and getting a kick out of doing just for fun was having a lasting effect on some of these kids out there, and was actually getting kids to read who might otherwise not read. And the act of reading and the act of kids learning how books can be allies in terms of being entertained and also being informed and being better educated and bettering themselves. If I put that all together, it became a no-brainer that I would continue to write. It became just, as it became more of a job, which it has over the years, it's not as much of a lark as it was at first, because I have deadlines and I have books I have to write, and sometimes the stories might not be coming as easy as I'd hoped. It becomes a responsibility, and part of that responsibility is knowing that there are kids out there who are going to be entertained and hopefully in some tiny way changed by the fact that they read my books, and that fact is enough for me to keep going.
I think important is exactly the word for that. Maybe it's not a cure for cancer, but it's definitely important. But I wouldn't I? I have the same madness you do.
There you do. There you do.
Well, a question from me, and we'll end on this. What is the one bit of advice that you wish someone had given to you when you were starting, and that you'd like to impart to the writers out there watching and listening?
Well, the one thing you and I talked about before this started, and I think we might even have talked about it when you interviewed me way back when, is the idea of kind of setting a regiment or a routine for yourself and trying to write every day and trying to hit a word count and trying to treat it, quote unquote, like a job. And there were a lot of people out there who actually told me, don't worry about word count. You're going to feel the time is right to write. And there are interviews with a lot of writers who say, I'm only happy when I'm writing, and I'm born to sit at my desk and write, and all that is great. But there are a lot of us out there, myself included, for whom writing, while incredibly rewarding, as we just talked about, is a real discipline, and it's a challenging discipline, and it's an easy discipline to lose sight of and lose your way around. And so I decided early on, not through other people telling me, but through myself, that I was going to make my writing process not scientific, but almost mathematical. I was going to sit down. I was going to figure out a way to get 500 words written in an hour and a half, and then I would either take a break or I would go to work, and I would come home, or on the way home, because I did some writing on the train early on, because I would take a train in and out of work. I would write another 500 and make it 1,000 for that day. And it's not like I would write the 1,000th word and it was in the middle of the sentence and I would stop. I mean, I'm not that crazy, but I would, if I'd written 1,010 words and I could have kept going, but it was in the middle of the scene, I would stop. But I was tired. I would stop. It helped me to be incredibly goal-oriented and regimented in my writing. And early on, I just remember hearing from most writers that writing was like breathing to them because they loved doing it so much. And since then, I've learned that writing is like breathing for some, but it's like real hard work for others. And there are a lot of writers out there, of course, who have said the same thing that I'm saying, that they have to treat it like a discipline and they have to treat it like a job, or else they won't get anything done. But early on, I was hearing more of the opposite, more that it was just a flow of inspiration that was going through you. And it wasn't like that for me. So I would say it took me some time to realize that it was okay to approach writing as a kind of an unromantic kind of active discipline. And if I'd known that right from the beginning, it might have been an easier process to get to that point.
I'm just thinking that if writing is like breathing, why am I able to ignore it for an entire day while I play Red Dead Redemption 2? I can't do that with breathing.
Procrastinating is like breathing.
Yes, that is very true. Tommy Greenwald, where can esteemed audience find you online at tommygreenwald.com? And I assume that you occasionally tweet.
I am very, very, I have a Twitter, I have Facebook, I have Twitter, very occasional, both those things. My website is almost an embarrassment. You can see links to my books and stuff like that, but I haven't blogged in a darn long time. I was blogging more actively early on, and I've let that slip by the wayside. But I am in all the usual places, and if any of your listeners have any more questions that we didn't get to, they can email me. My email is on my website. It's very simple, tommy@tommygreenwald.com. So I'm happy to continue this conversation, laptop to laptop, and that's about it.
That is an unprecedented level of access. I hope that all these writers are going to take advantage of it, and that you just get an avalanche of emails. Dear the Tommy Greenwald, please help me.
Bring them on.
And as always, you can find more about me at middlegradeninja.com. Read Tommy Facing the Original 7 Questions, as well as my reviews of at least 2 of the Charlie Joe Jackson books, all at middlegradeninja.com. Make sure you're back here come March for Jennifer March Soloway and some other guests that I mentioned earlier. Make sure you download your free copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Tommy, will you sign us off? Our sign-off phrase is hi-ya and what have you.
Hi-ya and what have you.